Well, Cato, thanks for joining us today to talk to us a little bit about Loop. Look, as all good founders and leaders of organizations, tell us the origin story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in London, England. My parents were both small business owners, so I very much grew up in a small business family and household. My mom ran a catering company. I used to kind of work in the kitchen, clean the floor, chop the vegetables, whatever needed to get done. And a little bit later on in life, I kind of developed an interest in technology, and then my first kind of career move was into financial services. So I've kind of like naturally worked into this place of a blend between technology and financial services, and that was kind of very much tied to our origins at Loop. The first kind of idea or thesis behind what we were building is we actually started out as a company called Lending Loop. And the idea behind what we were doing is making it easier for small businesses to get access to capital. So, kind of reliving some of my parents' experiences building and running their own companies. I saw how challenging it was for many business owners to run their business, but also specifically how underserved they were when it came to the products that they would get from banks. And so the idea originally behind the business was creating a, technology-based financial platform to make it easier for business owners to access capital. Over the first few years, we kind of had a really big impact. We provided over $100 million in loans to SMBs. But I think one thing that we realized in that early stage of our journey is that there was a lot more we could do and deliver for small businesses than just purely access to capital. There's a lot of other challenges that they deal with in their everyday lives. And for us to be a true financial partner to them, we needed to take that one step further and understand what were the things that we could do to help a business owner manage their finances every single day. And that's kind of what spurred our evolution from what was Lending Loop to what is now Loop. We understood through lots of dialogue and conversations with all of our customers and all the SMBs that we had the privilege of working with across Canada that they had a lot of challenges every day with their financial relationships. And one of the primary challenges that we'd hear about was that banking is still local, but business today is global. So if you think about a typical business that operates today, they have customers, employees, vendors and contractors or suppliers that are all around the world. But most of the things that they do when it comes to banking actually still live in the local bank branch that they have around the corner. And that creates a lot of challenges, pain point, and friction. And so that was a thing that we decided to really double down on and go deep on was trying to figure out how can we as a kind of technology business service our customers and make it easier for them to do business globally. And that was kind of the origin behind, what started as Lending Loop and ultimately became Loop.
No, it's great to hear, obviously, like the transition and how you start off in one area and then obviously begin to realize through actually engaging with customers what the reality is. In terms of that differentiator, you talked about how banking is local, but business is global. What's sort of the unique proposition you'd say that allows you to sort of work in this space that maybe the big banks here in Canada, struggle to do or find more challenging?
Yeah, I think, when it comes to traditional financial institutions, their infrastructure, when it comes to like both how the organizations are set up as well as the technology that supports the business, is quite old. And that makes it very difficult for them to move and make changes and adapt to the current business environment. And so, for us, the advantage that we have every day when it comes to supporting our customers is we're able to think 10 years down the road of like what does a business need and what is a business going to need as the financial world around them continues to evolve. So the advantage we really have is we think in a way that I would describe as default global. When everything that you do when it comes to managing your money and your financial products with a bank originates from this like branch centric model that I was talking about before. Like I need to send a payment to China, for example. Most banks today, believe it or not, still say, "Oh, if you need to send an international wire, come on down to the bank branch. We'll have someone there. We'll make some phone calls and we'll make this happen." If you're doing that once a month or a quarter, that's probably not that big of a deal. But if you're a business that is buying inventory daily or weekly, and you're sending payments all over the world, that model just doesn't work for you. It's arcane, it's very inefficient, it's costly, and so that's an example of products where we're able to say, hey, instead of doing that, can we provide a much more seamless experience for a business so that they can log into our platform, have all their vendors in one place, and we make it basically as easy as clicking a button to make that payment rather than having to go into a branch, lose a bunch of money on FX, spend a lot on wire fees to send a payment.
That's no, that's great. And obviously we're seeing real transformation occurring right now, obviously in the payment space. As you think about sort of these suite of services and you think about the infrastructure that you're building out on the platform, what's sort of been most kind of rewarding for you and the folks who use your platform?
I think ultimately the thing that gives me the most joy and satisfaction is the stories that we hear from customers. So to give an example, one of our very early customers, when we started building the Loop platform, which is about 3 years ago, they came to us and they were kind of like in a panic. They said, we've just secured this really large contract with a big customer in the US. We've been working on it for months. Their AP department just reached out and said, we need to set you up as a vendor in our system. We need your banking information. And they asked for their routing number and account number, which is effectively like the American version of a transit number and an account number. So it's like, their local banking details. And they went back and said, we don't have that. And the AP department was like, well, this is the only way we can get you set up in our system. It's a silly little anecdotal story, but it ultimately, we were able to go help that business. In about 24 hours, we got them access to U.S. banking information so that they could receive that payment, get set up, and that ultimately allowed them to eliminate that friction, save money, but most importantly, start working with that customer. I think those are the types of stories that we really love to hear because we see the impact that we directly have on customers where we just make their lives easier or we help them win business or we help them grow to a new market. We've spoken to lots of people that are looking for new suppliers or they're going to a new market to buy new inventory and we're able to kind of like step in and be that conduit or that access point to help them grow their business. Ultimately, the entrepreneurs and the businesses that we work with are the ones that are doing all the work. We're just trying to be a wind in their back versus versus an obstacle to them going.
Yeah, no, as someone who runs, an organization, even just here in Canada, I mean, the amount of, challenges and frustrations, I won't name which bank we're with, but, the issues and things that we face. So I can only imagine how much more challenging that is, trying to do it from a global perspective. Um, Thinking a little bit about sort of like trends, right? I think you've had close to $2 billion go through your platform or over, from what I've read. What kind of patterns are you seeing in terms of these financial flows, and how is that helping shape Loop's product?
Yeah, as you see more and more volume of usage, you start to understand a little bit of a view into the economy and where things are heading, which is really interesting. And so when we start to extrapolate some of that data, we see just how much trade is happening across the border. And so the majority of our customers are managing payments and transactions that are outside of Canada, meaning, the stuff that they're buying or the people that they're selling to are most often outside the country. And so we see a huge amount of cross-border payment flows as we support our customers to, for example, spend money using a credit card in different currencies or receive payments to bank accounts in different countries. All of those flows give us data and information on what's happening on the ground when it comes to small businesses expanding. And I think it's an interesting narrative, especially right now at this moment in time, because obviously there's a big narrative that we're becoming less global. That, countries are going to start onshoring and bringing everything back into their home jurisdiction. But actually, what we see is quite the opposite. In actual fact, like some of the kind of recent disturbances in kind of global trade have actually, in some cases, made people start to look for new trade partners. So we've started to see, for example, businesses that 90% of their payment volume was just with the U.S. Maybe it's 80% with the U.S. and 10% with Europe now. And so those are kind of some of the micro trends I would say that we're seeing on a kind of business to business basis as people trade, but what we're not seeing is people start to, only buy domestically. I think you might see that in the consumer space. Like you might see individuals that are more buying local, but at least in the business context, I think the reality is that we live in a globally connected world and, trade will continue to happen. The countries we trade with might start to shift, but it's not going to change to being, a world of 100 years ago.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and obviously, kind of dancing around, Trump tariffs and sort of what that means. So would you say the data has begun to sort of indicate this sort of diversification of firms?
Slowly, yes. Look, I mean, I think on the macro side of things, I just read the other day that like Tesla is starting to move cars to Canada from Europe instead of from their Berlin gigafactory instead of from from Texas or California. So, I think that's obviously like the big news example that you see. But I think that that same thing is starting to play out as well in a kind of small to medium sized business context where people are looking at alternative suppliers, but it's a slow ramp up. Like these things don't happen overnight. You have to start building that relationship, do some test runs of kind of buying the inventory. But I do think that is going to start to slowly see a diversification, or we're going to start to slowly see a diversification.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, and obviously, that data will continue to obviously sort of reveal how the geopolitics is playing out. Um, we often hear that Canadian companies are underbanked or overlooked by traditional financial institutions. How does this affect a founder's ability to compete globally, and what role can fintechs like Loop play in closing this gap?
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the core reasons that we exist at Loop is because if you are a smaller or a medium-sized company and you're trying to compete on a global stage, you just simply do not have access to the banking services that larger businesses do. If you need accounts or payment services in different countries, if you go to a financial institution, they'll often just say, we don't support this or this isn't something we're willing to provide. Um, and that's just not true because if you go to a Fortune 500 company or if you're at a Fortune 500 company and you go talk to that same bank, they'll say, of course we can support you. Of course we can set up accounts for you in another country so you can do business there. They'll make the phone calls or they'll make the exceptions necessary to their policies to make sure that you're set up to be successful. And I think that level of service, that tailored, customized service is just not available to smaller companies. And that just creates a lot of friction. So the ultimate thing that we can do is eliminate friction so that if you are a business and you're trying to do business in another country, you're trying to work with people outside of Canada as a Canadian company, that should be just as easy as doing business in Canada. There's no reason that it needs to be more complex. And I think especially in the backdrop of that being true for large businesses, to level the playing field, I think one of the first starting points that we believe we can have an impact on is when it comes to financial services, how do we make it just as easy for, a small Shopify merchant to get the same level of, international banking services that Walmart has? Because the reality is Walmart has a treasury management department. They have access to banking relationships in hundreds of different countries. And so our goal or ambition is make that same level of access available to someone who's starting a Shopify store, because if we do that, we will make it easy for them to ultimately build their business more effectively, grow faster, and be successful.
Yeah, no, that's great. Help them compete, help them scale, help them grow. So look, you work with, hundreds of Canadian small businesses and startups. What's your perspective of kind of the current Canadian tech ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say that the most frustrating or unfortunate thing that I often see is we have so much talent here in Canada. Um, I speak to so many fantastic entrepreneurs, and it unfortunately seems that there's been an acceleration recently of people just doing business in the United States. And so like people going to investors who tell them they need to incorporate their business in the US, or they start selling to customers and they're like, I'm not even going to bother selling in the Canadian market just because there's too much friction and it's too challenging for me. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think we should support that. I think like economically, it's important for us to support exports, and if we can create businesses here and sell to other markets, that is a good thing. But I think if we want to enable people to be truly successful, we also should make it easier for them to be domestically successful. And I think that's unfortunately one of the big trends that we have seen in our platform and with our customers is just, far too many of them essentially just ignore Canada from day one as a market. And I totally understand the rationale. The US is 10 times bigger in terms of market size. So, of course, I would encourage anyone, go sell your product in the US. But I think we should make it such that Canada is a fantastic home testing ground and a base to build your business. But in many cases today, it's actually harder to do business here. And, if we continue to make that the case, we're just going to continue to see more businesses actually leave Canada and just operate in the US. And so hopefully we can, play a role and have an impact on at least, when it comes to banking and financial services, making that part easier to do business in Canada. But obviously, there's a lot more to it than just banking.
Yeah. No, look, I think that's a perennial challenge of member companies that are part of CCI, where often they'll sell, whether it be, to governments all over the world, but struggle to, to sell to our own or to large enterprise. So it's a challenge, right across the board. As you think about the ecosystem, what is, maybe the one idea or policy that you would, advocate for to support companies to be ambitious and to support them?
Yeah. I think competitiveness is going to be key. Um, we were you just had mentioned that for larger enterprises, even selling to governments is more challenging, but also selling to larger enterprises. Oftentimes, the reason for that is just there isn't enough competition in the ecosystem, and we're very close to a world where there's been a dearth of competition, which is banking. We've essentially had five options as Canadians to manage our financial services. And so I think if we can promote competition by leveling the playing field, making sure that we have less anti-competitive practices here, reduce regulation for smaller companies, I think that those are areas that we would definitely see an improvement in creating a better ecosystem and a better environment such that a large enterprise would actually want to do business with a smaller company. I think, unfortunately, today, just to use that example, if you're a large enterprise, you kind of like default to working with other large enterprises, and that's kind of a lot of what happens in Canada today. I think we need to, kind of really invest in smaller companies. There's a capital aspect to it. But I think for me, answering your question, outside of capital, I think, the regulatory environment and just making it easier to operate here and being kind of the best in the world and across a number of different industries, making it super easy to start and scale a company without facing a lot of barriers, I think is one of the ways that we can promote not just our own Canadian companies, but we can also promote people wanting to come to Canada to start businesses. I think we have to kind of change that paradigm from Canada is a difficult place to do business to it's one of the easiest places to do business. I want to go and start there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. And by eliminating hopefully some of that friction, allowing people to move here and to consider it a place to grow and build a business. What are your thoughts on where we're at right now with stablecoin and what that might for sort of the payments universe?
Yeah, I think there's two views or philosophies on the evolution of financial services. And I don't think that they need to be, diametrically opposed. But I think like the stablecoin crypto community has a view, which is like everything that exists in the world today is broken, which may be true. And we need to replace it all, right? Like we're just going to say like, let's start blank slate and let's rebuild banking, let's rebuild financial services from the ground up. I think I personally have a slightly different view to that. I think new technology and new instruments to manage money and to move money are fantastic, and I'm a huge supporter of that. But I think the right mix is going to be not breaking it all down and starting again, but how do we use modern tools and technology to integrate with the banking systems that exist all around the world. So when we think about like what Loop is, for example, we think about Loop almost as like a hub and spoke model where the banks that exist in all these different countries are the spokes. And if we can effectively connect all of them together in a much more efficient way, we will make it easier for people to do business internationally. We don't have to say, hey, we're not using domestic currencies, we're not using domestic banks, we're going to get rid of it all and start again. I think there's an in between, which is yes, there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of challenges managing your money in different countries, but maybe we can actually, using modern tools and technology, just make it easier to do that And I think that that is an easier way to capture the attention of businesses all around the world is like, how do we embed our product into their lives to just be a bolt on to what they're doing today versus saying, hey, like, no, forget how banking works. I'm going to offer you a totally new proposition. And I think like stablecoin can be part of that. So I'm not saying again, I think like there are use cases, for example, where it might be more efficient to move money through a stablecoin because there's no established payment rail that exists between two countries. But if there is already one, for example, Canada and the US, we don't necessarily need a stablecoin to unblock the friction of doing business across the Canadian and US border. We just need better technology, better product, and better innovation when it comes to banks on both sides of the border working together.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Do you think then that there's a place for, let's say, Canadian banks and Canadian institutions to go overseas? Is there opportunities for Canada to try and play a bit of a more, let's say, assertive role in thinking about some of these things?
100%. And I think when we were talking about making it easier to do business in Canada, I think that's a fantastic example of we should we should leverage our strength as a financial sector to make it such that people want to leverage a Canadian bank. And so do business with a Canadian bank, regardless of whether they're in Canada or not. So I think there's a huge opportunity. Unfortunately, I feel like currently we're missing that opportunity. There's a lot of U.S. banks that are playing in this space, which is specifically to elaborate on that. There are people all over the world that, if you're in like India or Brazil and you have the desire to move your money out of the country for various reasons, US banks are currently taking advantage of that. So there are a lot of US banks that are playing in this space that are going to other markets and saying, hey, become a customer of our bank. And I think that that's a fantastic proposition, obviously, in those cases, because the US is seen as a stable economy, stable currency. And so they're attracting more business and more deposits through that mechanism. We're not really doing that in Canada, but I absolutely believe that we can and should be doing that. But I think that's an example of because we have such tough regulation here, where we've made it such that we can only have five real competitors in the banking space, we don't have that same level of innovation that they have in the US, where there's banks that are starving for business and they're being creative and they're being innovative. So I think that's connecting those dots of we need to change the regulatory environment to make it more competitive. And if we do that, I think we have the innovators in Canada that can go and start to do things like that and make people in other countries want to do more business with us and ultimately grow our economy here.
That's really helpful in terms of like the framing of it. And so for you, like, so the big obstacle is just the regulatory hurdles that we have within our own country that prevent that from being able to happen.
Yes, and I think either prevent it from being able to happen or why the innovation just simply hasn't happened, right? Like if you're one of the big five banks in Canada, you don't have a need to innovate in that way, right? And so I think in that case, it's like there's no pushing from behind to have them innovate. And if you're a Loop or a challenger, a fintech challenger that's trying to come into the industry, there's simply too many obstacles to make that possible. So that we would love to offer that and make it easier for other people to do business with Canadian banks, but there's no Canadian banks we can work with to actually do that. And so I think that is a good example of, it's possible. It's not necessarily that there is a regulatory obstacle to doing it, but there's no willpower in that case from banks to want to do it that are Canadian because they have the ability to be status quo and be happy. Whereas again, like using the US as the opposite example, that is an environment and a dynamic where their status quo is not good enough. They need to continue to push the boundary. And I think the fact that there's more competition is the main reason for that. And the reason there's more competition is the regulatory environment. So I think that's kind of the steps to connect those dots.